Attention! The National Weather Service has issued a hurricane warning for the entirety of the National Hockey League. Please stay tuned for further information from the Storm Cellar.
Welcome back to the Storm Cellar. It's been a week for me because I had the wonderful Madeline with me last week. Listening to it made me realize how much I missed Ray, because Ray can call me the brains all he wants to. I just organize things. Clearly, Ray, you can tell he has a background in radio because, yeah, it was, for me, it was a little rough. So sorry, Mads. Mads and I had a good time, but maybe not the most polished of all episodes. So thank goodness Ray is back. How
come on now.
Things with you, Ray?
I'm good. I listened to that episode and thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to be kicked to the curb. Brad's going to realize I'm not needed anymore.
Oh no, sir.
Whatever. So it was a great episode, and Mads was awesome, and you did a great job. I don't know, like it's been a minute. It's been a minute since we've been together, and I think everyone just needed a break from from us in general. I don't know, but we're glad to have them back because we have got a very special guest that I'm going to learn a lot from. And
I've been waiting on this one for like a year, I think.
Yeah. And so, you know what? And you actually have a lot of the background on him and stuff. Everyone, we know him as JFresh, but he's given us the go ahead. We can call him Jack. Jack joins us, and he's JFresh, responsible for some very important information that he provides on players through a system on these hockey cards. And I don't know where you found him, but I've been
the best hockey card guy on Twitter.
Yeah, no question. Sure. So do you want to bring him in and do the official intro? Like, I already said his name and stuff, but you've got all the details.
Sure. Everybody, this is Jack.
Oh, come on now.
JFresh Hockey. Literally, I think I first reached out like a year ago, and obviously, Jack is a busy dude. If you look at the requests and things that he gets for player cards all the time, in terms of reliability, that's where when I was looking at things, because there are a few people who kind of do this, like, right, we also have like Kane Stats brand who does a lot of Kane Stats and not quite this fashion, but there's a lot of expert analysis out there that I feel like where people do a really good job. But to me, Jack, the way you put things together, both visually and in terms of the way I kind of see your percentages in the way that you analyze things, I think is really spot on. So welcome. We're really excited to have you. And I'm hoping some of our people who are a little newer to hockey who listen to us will be able to pick up some things, and maybe as we dive into this a little bit, they'll be able to maybe look at your card and won't feel intimidating. You'll be able to go, okay, I kind of understood it because your design I think is great already, but maybe we can get them to that next level. So welcome. It's really great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, fellas.
Now, we here in the Storm Cellar, when you pull up a chair, we always like to find out the details about our guest. We like to shine the spotlight on our guests and find out their details. Now, off recording, you told us that you're a Pens fan, but you come by it honestly. We're not going to hold it against you, and we don't hold it against anyone. We've had Devils fans, and we've had Bruin fans, and we've even had fans of the team that shall not be named on the show. So we're happy to have you aboard. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into hockey, how you latched on to the Pens, and of course, who's your favorites right now? And you can even give us a summary of where you think your Pens are headed into the coming season. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, well, I'm originally from the East Coast of Canada. I live in Toronto now, but I'm not a Leafs fan, and I'm not from there. I grew up in Halifax, and so I was a little kid when Sidney Crosby kind of started up in the Quebec Major Junior League. I started getting into hockey. I didn't grow up playing. My parents are not hockey fans. I actually got into it the same way that I would imagine a decent number of Hurricanes fans probably did, which is through the video games. I had a CD-ROM game called Backyard Hockey, which was a pretty simple game. It was simple enough that I could actually play it when I was 7 or 8 years old. But it kind of just got me obsessed with hockey, and it all took off from there. My team was actually originally Colorado, because strangely enough, that was the year that Paul Kariya and Teemu Selanne were had kind of teamed up to make a super team in Colorado, and Paul Kariya was my favorite player in the video game. So I was like, oh, he's in Colorado, like that's my favorite team. And then the lockout hit, all the players I liked on Colorado left, and so I kind of sat down. I was 8 years old, sat down in front of the draft lottery for the local kid, Sidney Crosby, and basically resolved that wherever he ended up, that would be my team. And fortunately, it wasn't Anaheim, because then I would never have been able to watch any of his games. Like, it's hard enough in the Eastern time zone, but in the Atlantic time zone where everything's pushed back an extra hour, those games would have started at 11. That would have been no good, but it turned out pretty well having it be Pittsburgh. So have obviously been able to enjoy them winning plenty of Stanley Cups, and hopefully after this summer, even if the Erik Karlsson trade doesn't get them to another cup, but hopefully at least it'll be pretty entertaining. So I think it all worked out pretty well.
Question, Ray, or for both of you. Can anybody tell me who won the Stanley Cup the year Sidney Crosby was a rookie?
That would be the Carolina Hurricanes, of course. Although I have to admit, I was cheering pretty hard for the Edmonton Oilers in that in that finals. I remember I think we were on like a class trip watching that Game 7 on the hotel TV, and being pretty upset that Edmonton could pull it off. That was in the streak where Canadian teams kept making the finals and kept losing. So I was pretty upset.
I'm sorry to disappoint, but at the same time, I'm not at all sorry to disappoint.
Jack, I was employed by a radio station that was part of the Edmonton Oiler radio network, and it being the Hurricane fan working in that area was I had a lot of fun, I'll tell you that much, but it was nervous to be sure. Jack, that's great. What now? The Pens land Karlsson, and there was a lot of budget gymnastics going on to make that all go. And I know, San Jose, they were saying there's no way we're eating half the contract. Absolutely not. So you knew that the reason why he wasn't being dealt as quickly, everyone waited a long time for him, was they needed to get at least another team, maybe two, in to deal with a contract that size. You obviously have to be happy with landing Karlsson and Letang. That's a pretty decent pair.
Yeah, I was pretty thrilled about it, and I recognize that there's a lot of potential downsides there. It's a hugely risky contract. The reason I think the Pens could make it work was that they didn't need as much retention as other teams probably would have, which means there's so many ways that this thing could go south in the next couple of years. But the Penguins at this point, they've built up enough cup rings and enough success with this era that I think that they could afford to just take a massive swing and see what happened. And I don't think they had to give up too much to make that happen. But, honestly, I know the Hurricanes were kind of the other team that was majorly in the mix with, Seattle, and people were talking about Toronto also hanging around. Honestly, I think I kind of said from the start about this, I just don't think Karlsson really made sense for any of those other teams that are kind of trying to get that first ring. Or at least that first ring kind of in this generation or in this decade. The Hurricanes, if the Hurricanes don't win the cup in the next couple of years, I think it's going to be a bit of a failure for this era, just because they've built up such a good team. I don't know if that's where you want to be taking massive swings on an expensive player at Karlsson's age. I think that their process for building up the blue line kind of makes a lot more sense and gives them a lot more flexibility. with the Penguins, I mean, it's pretty much house money at this point, and I'm certainly more excited about watching Erik Karlsson next year than I would be if it was just Lars Eller and Noel Acciari and whatever other defensive guys Dubas had brought in free agency.
I think EK gives the Penguins a legit shot. I mean, I think they're at least in contention now, right?
It gives them a ceiling for sure.
Yeah, exactly. It's so a question, and you can answer this however you want, whether it's more stats based or gut feeling. I was excited about the Karlsson idea to come to Carolina, mostly just because it would be kind of outrageous to me, right? They had already brought in D'Angelo, they already brought in Orlov. They're taking a fundamental. The idea was, they're taking this fundamental thing that they do great, which is play some of the best defense in hockey, and they're gonna, kind of up in the cart. I like defensive defensemen. I always have. Paul Coffey being the one exception I'll always make room for. Not that I don't want offense from our blue line, but guys like Burns, I love to see him bring it. But I also, looking at your card for Karlsson, he's a 99% WAR on offense and a 0 on defense. Do you like that style of player? Do you like a more offensive minded blue line, or would you, whether it's the Pens or just in general, do you think an offensive defense is a better idea in the current state of the NHL? Maybe is that if that makes sense if I put it that way, or would you prefer more of a just let the forwards shoot and score and just defense should keep the puck out of the net?
Well, I think a lot depends on how your team is playing and what kind of talent you have around him. Like, I mean, if Karlsson had come in and he had, like Jacob Slavin playing next to him or something like that, then I'm sure that would kind of cover up for the mistakes that Karlsson makes. In Pittsburgh, they're probably going to be playing him with Marcus Pettersson, who I think is a pretty responsible defender. I mean, on San Jose, I think the way that Karlsson was playing, I think one of the reasons that, you kind of saw him take off this season and score 100 points and go completely crazy is because he could play the way that he plays. He could carry the puck, make these kind of outrageous skill plays and brilliant passes and stuff. And because the team was rebuilding, he really didn't have to worry about, whether what he was doing was super risky and was going to lead to costly errors going the other way. Which, on a contending team, I don't think he's going to have quite that leash. And he's probably going to have to play a little bit more responsibly in his own end. But, at the same time, I would rather see a guy kind of have a little bit of a defensive conscience at least, and maybe not be a total liability in that area. And I mean, Brent Burns is an example of a guy who, when he does want to add that defensive element to his game, he can, like we saw in Carolina this past season. But yeah, I mean, I'd rather have an outrageously talented offensive defenseman than just a complete, defensive, nothing happens, but he doesn't have any puck skills guy, just because I feel like, I'd rather have the talent and then maybe be able to insulate it a bit than just having a complete stay-at-home guy. And I think there's a good reason that the offensive defensemen tend to get paid a little bit more because there's more of a ceiling in terms of what they can do, and you can kind of try to at least cover up their deficiencies in the other areas of the game.
Yeah, I agree. I think it takes a mix, right? You can't have too many of one type. Like I think Don Waddell has always been I want an offensive guy and a really defensive guy pairing on all three pairings. And that's why the EK trade to me, when I really am honest about it, didn't make sense for Carolina, because now you have 4 offensive minded defensemen and, 2 of the 3 of them, really 3 of the 3 of them could be a top pair guy. So who's going to make millions and millions to play on the third pair, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think a guy like Orlov fits their team philosophy a lot better. I think he also adds a lot of that puck moving element. I think he's a really underrated puck mover. He's going to be the best at that on the Carolina blue line this year. But he also plays a responsible defensive game, which fits into their philosophy a little bit more. And they got him, I think, on a contract that obviously has a high price tag, but they got the short term. And I don't think they have to worry about the possible massive drop off that you might see from Erik Karlsson, depending on whether the injuries start to recur or if he starts just declining from being in his mid-30s.
Jack, when the Pens missed out on the playoffs this past season, a lot of people were kind of stunned, especially since all they needed, I think, was at least just 1 point out of the final 2 games, one of which against Chicago. I can't imagine how angry you might have been. I was stunned. I just thought the Pens were gonna find a way to make it through. Is going after a big contract like Carlson's, going after a guy who is, you know, amazing on offense, but is I don't know. I think it's fair to call him a liability on T. I mean, the man makes a lot of big mistakes. He's just not defensive. Do you think that is the perfect reaction or an overreaction going after him based on the way the season ended last season?
Yeah, I think they had to go big. They had to take a swing because the problem, especially kind of after July 1st when the dust settled, Dubas I think really emphasized bringing in a lot of defensive players. He brought in my fellow Nova Scotian Ryan Graves on defense to replace Brian Dumoulin, who had been slowing down a lot. He added Achari and Lars Eller and Matt Nieto, and he kind of rebuilt a new, very defense-oriented bottom six. But looking at that lineup, how it came together after July 1st and after the free agents had left, it just didn't, it was kind of like a 90-point looking team. And you can't be running into Crosby and Malkin's last year's with a 90-point team that maybe, could sneak into the wild card. Even if maybe there were some defensive issues last season, I think one of the bigger issues they had was a lot of guys had kind of scoring slumps. Crosby put up a lot of points last season, but honestly, he should have had more if Brian Rust and Jake Gensel were finishing scoring chances like they usually do. I think there's some luck elements to it. There was, I think maybe a bit of demoralization on that team, a little frustration, which hopefully will be shaken up a little bit by, even just by having kind of, the big new star player in the room, I hope will kind of add a bit of a jolt and a competitive edge to the Penguins this year. But for me, my perspective on the Carlson thing was always that, you need to take a massive stab to kind of, even if there's a lot of risk with a contract like that, I think the Penguins just needed to take a huge stab and add another star player and just see if it worked, because that roster was looking like a fringe playoff team. And at that point, there's really no point in just trying to sneak into the playoffs if you're talking about the end of some star players' careers. I would much rather they really try to go for it in the next 2 or 3 years and then have it be catastrophic when they completely fall off, as opposed to what I think the previous management was doing, which was just kind of ambling towards catastrophe, which of course finally happened when they missed the playoffs.
And you mentioned management and stuff, and how did you feel about the acquiring of Dubas out of Toronto? What was your take on that? Is he the fit, or is he the mind that is needed to get things on the right track, or at least back on track, because the Penguins were just...
Yeah, well, it seemed like there really was no actual direction with the previous management group. There have been the insider reports and stuff that say that they essentially fixated on certain players and brought them in kind of irrespective of whether they actually fit with the roster. Michael Granlund being one of the most perplexing ones, where they traded him for a second-round pick and then he has to turn around and be cap dumped just a couple of months later. With Dubas, with the Leafs, I think he made some good moves. He made some not so good moves. Anybody's going to have a mixed record, but at least kind of what I'm hopeful for and pleased about with him is that I think there's a good process. He knows how to bring in good people. He's super well connected, obviously, from having worked in Toronto, and I think they build up a good war chest of kind of talented hockey analysts. I mean, somebody who, I'm familiar with. Cam Sharon was, analyzing Leafs and Canucks games using kind of his own privately tracked stats this season, and he was kind of blogging all the way through the year. He was brought on by Dubas to work for the Penguins, and I know that he's a smart fella. So it's kind of that kind of thing where even if some of the free agency contracts that Dubas signed so far, I'm not 100% on board with. I can at least see the vision in a way that I wasn't seeing with the Hextall Burke era.
Yeah, and I think Dubas gets some unfair criticism for the way that, I mean, Toronto finally got past the first round, right? They still got bounced earlier with the firepower they have. I think everybody agrees they should have gone farther, but I don't know how much you can put on that at Kyle's feet. I mean, obviously he was ousted in Toronto. It sounds like you're happy with him in Pittsburgh. And as an analytics-driven guy, I mean, I don't know if there's anybody better in hockey at what he does, except for, and I'm biased in this, but maybe Eric Tulsky of the Canes. Eric has put together a program here in Carolina where they're competitive every year after that, 8-9 year drought. And now they're making smart moves that aren't necessarily flashy. But I feel like, Dubas has this, same kind of thing where, did he bring in Carlson, which is kind of a flashy name? Yes, but is it also the right move? Like you said, like, does he have a plan? And it's like, yeah, I think he does. So I thought that was a great pickup by Pittsburgh. I think Toronto is going to be sorry that they let that happen. I mean, there's the political pressures of Toronto. It affects management as much as it does the players in a lot of ways, if not more so, because ultimately the buck stopped at him, and it did. But he put together a team in Toronto. I mean, what team wouldn't want that first line? Their big thing is if they had a real top-notch goaltender and they didn't keep hoping for, like, oh, this guy looks like he's going to be the next guy and then wasn't. I mean, they should have gotten to a final in the last couple of years, and Dubas put together what I thought was a really phenomenal, hockey team. But
yeah,
ultimately it was just too much firepower, not quite enough, on the back end. So
yeah, well, like, I don't know, because that Leafs team, they put together a bunch of different kinds of teams in the time that Dubas was around, and he made a lot of different kinds of moves. Like he brought in skilled players, he brought in vets, he brought in two-way centers and defensive defensemen and physical players. He really kind of, over the course of his time with the Leafs, showed a lot of adaptability. If something didn't necessarily work, I think he kind of would go in different directions, and ultimately it didn't work. But I think the main reason that the Leafs hadn't won in the playoffs, in his tenure, I don't think too much of it comes down to the moves that he made. By the end of his tenure, I think he built a very solid defensive team that was maybe a bit underrated in that regard. By adding guys like TJ Brody, for example, and Jake Muzzin before he got hurt, and those kinds of players. It really was, the Stars didn't score when they needed to score, and there's not a lot that Kyle Dubas can do about that. If Austin Matthews or Mitch Marner, if they go cold, Dubas can't force them to put the puck in the net. They kind of have to do that on their own. So, I think the process was fairly strong, even if there's certain moves he made in Toronto that I didn't agree with. And yeah, really for me, it was between him and Eric Tulsky, who you mentioned. Like those were the two names that I wanted the Penguins to focus in on. And it seems like they got, a guy who I think should be able to bring in some smart people to kind of shepherd in this next era of Penguins hockey, even if we couldn't poach Tulsky.
I think all Canes fans in the know, every time a GM job comes open, we all collectively hold our breath when we hear Tulsky's name mentioned. Like I know I'm not alone in saying I'd love to see Don Waddell move to president and Tulsky move to general manager and pay the man and be done with it. And hopefully there's things behind the scenes that we don't know, and maybe things are right where Eric wants them to be. But had we lost him to the Pens, I would have been really upset.
Yeah, no question, Jack. So look, let's move into your specialty, your wheelhouse, and I have to apologize as a 52-year-old non math. I got into broadcasting because I couldn't do math. The analytics in all of sport has kind of swept in. So many times we looked at the way things were done and everyone was using their eyes, what they knew about the game, put the stats aside kind of thing, and just watch the game, and what you want, or the type of player that you want. And then analytics comes in, and it can confound a lot of fans because analytics don't always match your eyes, right? And I need an explanation of how all of the stats bring anyone, where you just look at it, you look at a sheet and say, these are his numbers, this is the guy that fits. And if you could even make a selection of a player without watching them play, just look at the analytics from your cards and stuff and say, yeah, this is the fit, go get them. As an older fan or whatever, who just never understood the math, didn't really care about the stats other than who was on my draft pool. I mean, I need help explaining all of this, so why don't you take us through it?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, if you saw my high school report cards, you wouldn't be calling me a math guy. No, I mean, there's a reason. You see at the bottom of the cards, it says that the war model was created by my good friend Patrick Bacon, who's he's a data scientist. He's based in Silicon Valley. He's a real bright guy, and he is more so kind of the number cruncher. We kind of went into this together because I despite my lack of a hard math background, or even that much of a soft math background, I kind of took to hockey analytics, pretty hard because for me it was a way to kind of get more information. Analytics is really just kind of extra information, and as a Penguins fan, and even someone who does watch a decent number of games kind of around the league, obviously more so now than I used to. There's a lot of firmly held opinions that I had on players who were on other teams, other than the Penguins, that really weren't based on all that much. It was a lot of point totals or hearsay or, crap that I had heard from secondhand from somebody who was a fan of that team. And, I found myself, like, I think I was joking about this the other day. If you went through my HF boards, the hockey forum account from 2015 or 2014 or so, you could find a lot of me arguing vehemently about Mikhail Bodker and how the Penguins should trade for him. And I probably watched him play like once or twice in my entire life, but goddamn, right. I was heated about that guy because I knew he was fast, and I figured he was good defensively. He'd fit with Crosby. And I feel like a whole lot of conversations that happen in hockey. There's obviously real smart people out there who watch a lot of hockey and they understand a lot. But I think there's a decent amount of people who maybe they've only seen a player in passing, or they've seen his point totals or whatever. For me, kind of discovering hockey analytics was basically seeing just kind of a pile of this extra information that you could use to really understand more about the players around the league. What drives success, what they're good at, and I think especially in the last couple of years, those stats have improved and expanded to the point where, I certainly wouldn't run an NHL franchise purely based on player cards. There's of course a huge role for watching the game and scouting, for kind of understanding what's driving player results, what might translate from team to team, what might translate from season to season. But for me, having analytics, whether they're the player impact numbers, like the wins above replacement and the offense and defense driving and all that kind of stuff, or looking at what we would call microstats, which are the kind of manually tracked numbers that Hurricanes fan Corey Schneider has been tracking around the NHL for the past couple of years, that really show kind of individual talents, whether it's passing or transition play, or rush defense or puck retrievals and recoveries and things like that. You know, they really open up the game, especially to people who maybe can only really watch their team play and don't, you know, don't have the time on their hands to be watching, you know, 82 games from every single team. So, you know, there's some of it that's, you know, decently complicated, and some of it, you know, does have some strange math behind it that can be a little counterintuitive. But, you know, my goal, and you know, I hope to some extent I succeed a little bit, is to try to make it a little bit more understandable, and, you know, add a little bit of, you know, visual design flair to it, to make it a bit more digestible, because some of it is pretty complicated on its face, especially when you're just talking about, you know, raw numbers and things like that. But, you know, I don't think everybody needs to completely internalize it or make it the basis of their understanding of hockey. You know, it's a certain way to enjoy and appreciate the game, you know, that I personally enjoy, and I think a couple other people do. But it, you know, it never breaks my heart when somebody says they don't care about the analytics or stats or anything, because that may just not be how they like to enjoy the sport.
Yeah, and one of the things I like about your cards in particular is, and you know, the people who listen to our show, and we mentioned beforehand, we have a lot of newer people. We try and make hockey accessible for folks. You know, we always say that, hey, everybody starts as a bandwagon fan, right? Everybody starts with going to one game or seeing one game, and it grows from there. And the way that you present the information, I think, makes it really easy, so that you don't have to be a math person, right? You don't even have to understand hockey. The card I have in front of me is Alexander Semin. So Alex, for folks who don't know, was great in Washington. He was brought over to the Canes. A lot of people thought that was just a complete bust. I mean, it kind of was in a lot of ways, but the eye test and what he did in Carolina, you know, that's a snapshot of who he was as a player. You know, so, you know, when I look at your card for him, you know, projected WAR, and WAR means wins above replacement, is 99%.
Yeah,
So
this would have been what, 2000. This would have been when he was at the Caps, right? This was like 2009.
yeah, this was the end of his Caps. Yeah, he was 25 on this card, so that would have been right toward toward the end of his Cap career. And you don't have to, you know, if you know, most people can understand like wins above replacement. If you put this guy in versus the next guy, you know, down the list, you know, you have, you know, essentially a much better chance of winning, right? Versus something like his defense 26%, which means, okay, so you can kind of look at that, even the color coding, right? It's pink, so it's like, okay, well, let's, you know, he's a little better at defense than maybe the next guy, but he's definitely not a defensive guy. So I like how the fact that the way your cards get put together is, you don't need to know the math, you don't even really need to understand hockey to get at least a sense of what this player might be capable of, and then you kind of hit the nail on the head in that. Sometimes I see people arguing over player cards and the analytics, and I'm like, but you're missing the forest for the trees. Like, you know, Alex might be a 99% WAR and might have a 96% offense, but does he play the style of hockey that your team plays? You know, is he going to mesh in? Is that really what you need? And so it's you know, you can't just go by, I think, like the cards and the analytics alone. You have to, there is still some of that eye test and knowing how, you know, it's like ingredients. You can take eggs and sugar and flour and beat them together, and that doesn't mean you're going to get a cake. You know, it just means you have all the ingredients there for a cake, but you have to know how to bake it, right? And I think the way that you put things together makes it really simplified for a lot of folks to kind of start to understand that. But at the same time, for people who really know what they're talking about, they can also look and see what you're doing and go, you know, okay, I agree with that. And I see people discussing different models. I know there's another, I don't want to out anybody, but there's another account that puts out, you know, their player cards. And I am one of the people who thinks that their whatever metrics they're using for defense just feel way off. You know, they have, you know, Jacob Slavin is like an okay-ish defenseman who is, once again, you know, a bias thing, but I mean, the guy's a top 10 defenseman in the league. Like, if you don't want to put him in the top, that's fine. The guy, you know, the guy covered for TA, he's covered for Burns. You can put him with anybody and they look better because of how well he covers. And, you know, whenever I go through different people's cards and different analytics, I always end up coming back to yours, because I feel like you know, you guys have done you and Patrick have done such a great job of, you know, going through and looking at things and kind of getting the right, you know, the right recipe, to go back to my cooking analogy, to where things kind of make sense. It's not always going to be perfect, but I think you guys do a really good job of to me, you're always in the ballpark. It's always I kind of agree with that. I might have some disagreement here and there, but I don't see anything I'm like, oh, that's just feels really wrong, even just by the eye test. So
I think ballpark is a good way to think about it. I mean, there's obviously a decent amount of uncertainty when it comes to anything in hockey. I'll have to hit you with the no comment on the other player cards. Unfortunately,
anybody who listens who knows exactly who it is. But we try and keep things positive most of the time. So.
But yeah, I mean, one thing that I try to point out is that if you take any stat in hockey from goals and assists to these more complicated ones, if when a player switches teams, for example, everything from your eye test all the way down to the most detailed stat is going to become less predictable. There is an environmental factor, but I think people maybe will sometimes overestimate how well their eyes are able to pick that out. How immune they are to things like fan base wide narratives where it kind of becomes like a confirmation bias. Like for one example that I'll use is back when the Penguins were kind of making the back-to-back cup runs, I was dead set, in part because of online fan communities I was in, that Chris Kunitz was completely washed up, like absolutely useless. Like they had to trade him for a 5th round pick. I think I was saying that they should trade him for like Josh Joris or something just to get him off the roster. And I go back and obviously he was a big part of those back-to-back cup teams again. And the underlying numbers that we have now, I kind of have to look at them and be like, okay, you know what? Maybe I kind of just talked myself into a furor about this guy, and he was actually still a pretty good contributor. And I was just driving myself crazy because I wanted the Penguins to play somebody else instead of him or something like that. There's all kinds of ways that, even an experienced fan can watch the game and maybe jump to unfair or maybe difficult conclusions. I mean, especially when it comes to things like comparing players across different teams or guys that you maybe don't see very much. And I think, the analytics and whatever stats you're going to use, whether they're, the wins above replacement or micro stats or things like that, I think it's just a way to give yourself more information to go off of. And I think as time has gone by, we have a decent, bit of evidence that they can be useful for identifying who's going to be a great player in the future. I mean, the kind of classic examples of, from when I started doing this back in 2020 or so was, the stats kind of suggested that two guys who were really primed to kind of break out were Valeri Nichushkin and Devon Toews. This is when Nichushkin, I think, had just started on the Avalanche. He was playing on their 4th line, and Devon Toews was on the Islanders. And Toews, I think he had kind of a bit of a tough playoff series against Tampa Bay, but other than that, he had been a huge part of their blue line while playing pretty tough top 4 minutes. And the Islanders, they dumped him to Colorado for a 2nd round pick. And, at the time, people like me were saying, oh man, the Avalanche just got like a really, really great player. Like he's going to be perfect on that top pairing with Makar. And a lot of people who weren't, familiar with him or even who were Islanders fans who watched him every night said, oh no, he's no good. He just was crap in the playoffs. Like, I'm glad we got rid of him for a 2nd round pick. And then, you turn around, a couple of years later, and I think Devon Toews is pretty universally considered to be one of the better defensemen in hockey, played a huge role on a cup winning team. Those are the kinds of things where if you know what you're looking for and you're kind of willing to, let yourself occasionally be wrong on that kind of thing, I think these numbers can be very useful in identifying players who are poised to break out or who are maybe underappreciated or who bring value in areas of the game that you might not be familiar with. But, honestly, even if you're not willing to, make the leap to kind of the wins above replacement and numbers like that, because I understand, they are a bit abstract and they can sometimes be a little bit counterintuitive. and give you results that maybe seem wrong on their face, because nothing's going to be perfect. I think just to shout out Corey Schneider again, who does the manual stat tracking. I think those numbers are really like that takes out the kind of degree of separation. It basically becomes like counting the eye test, like instead of like what your eyes are seeing, which is, oh, he passes the puck really well, or he carries the puck in the zone super well. Having kind of track numbers in a good sample across the entire league makes it possible that you can actually kind of compare guys and say, oh, okay, instead of being like, oh yeah, Sebastian Aho, he's a good passer. You can say, okay, Sebastian Aho, like here is how good he is as a passer compared to other players around the league. And there is still context that you need to have around that, obviously. But I think it just gives you a better baseline of understanding than you would have if you didn't use it.
Yeah. And I like the fact that you include the teammates block as part of your cards too. And for those who don't know, like the teammates block just kind of gives you an idea, like, is this person playing with first liners? Are they playing with fourth liners? What's the level of people they're playing with? Because, this is kind of one of those, like, if you put Martinook on the first line, in some ways he's playing with two guys who are way above his skill level, which on the cards you might go, hey, that's, the analytics here looks a little funky because, like, why is this guy on the first line? And then for much of the season, it didn't work. And then the Hurricanes play New Jersey, and the man goes off and gets the Gretzky comparison. So that's one of the other things I just wanted to point out, that like you said, you have to have context, right? There's more there than just the raw numbers, and I like the fact that you do try and include some of that by like having like the teammates block. Like, we get a lot of heat about KK from the team who the fans of the team who shall not be named. And it's like, well, yeah, he did that, but he did that as a fourth line center in Carolina, playing with guys who aren't honestly as good as he was. When they moved him up to second line center, those teammates go up, like his point production goes up, everything looks better for him. So, the contextual piece, I think, is a big part of what sometimes people forget about, like, looking at like the cards, the analytics is like, this is just one frame of reference, for example. So,
Yeah. And so go ahead, because I've got a lot of questions, but
okay,
I want to go through that one.
Just going to say quickly, yeah, I mean, and the context, I think, is also, it's a reason that, I obviously, as much as, I'm proud of the player cards, and I like seeing people use them, and I like seeing people kind of have conversations that are brought on by them. When I'm posting about players, like when transactions happen or things happen, I do try to kind of provide an extra layer of analysis that may not be able to be represented on the player cards, but there's talking about like specific skills they have or the role that they're playing or things like that. Because, like you said, there's a good amount of information that you can get from, wins above replacement. You can say, oh, this guy has a good defensive impact and stuff like that. But, I find that even that can be quite a bit too abstract and non-intuitive for most hockey fans who like me don't have that kind of math first background and may not have internalized how like regression models and all that stuff works. I think putting that kind of stuff into pure hockey terms and digging in a little bit deeper and watching the games as well to figure out what the process is for that player, what the actual strengths and weaknesses are, whether it's their skating or their shooting or their passing and things like that, really kind of turns it from, what could just be a bunch of graphics flying around that, some people might not really understand or trust, to actually just kind of being better hockey analysis of players and a way for people who maybe don't know everything about every player on every team to have a little bit more information at their fingertips. For example, I mean, the biggest use case for them for me is, if your team acquires a player that you've seen play like once or twice, if ever, you want to get an idea of what that guy's good at, if he's any good. Like when the Penguins traded for Granlund, and I think a lot of people thought, oh, he's a 50-point player, like that's not bad. But then, you can use those stats to realize, okay, well, he kind of needs the power play to produce. He's really bad defensively. And sure enough, that acquisition ends up being kind of a nightmare. That's kind of ideally for me what I like to see it being used for, is kind of adding that extra information and really kind of giving fans an idea of who's around the league, who maybe they're not seeing very much, and giving them maybe that better understanding.
So when we threw the information out on Twitter, X, whatever we were calling it today, we asked a lot of people, we asked those of our listeners who tune into the show if they have any questions to put to you, to fire them into us, and we'll pass them along. But I, as the co-host, the assistant captain here in the Storm Cellar, I'm putting my questions right to the very front, first and foremost. And I've got three. I've got three that kind of will help me in understanding more about where you're coming from here. Are the cards that you create, okay, here's number one. Are the cards that you create, are they basically a snapshot of what you're seeing immediately, or do you continue accumulating the stats and stuff for their entire career? Like, is it a stat for one particular player who is playing on this team, and this is what you're getting with this squad, or is it more career long?
So the numbers that appear on kind of the regular player cards, like the one that I post and get posted around the most, they use, like, on the top, it's the projected, or essentially what's going into that is that you have these different kind of components of wins above replacement, the way the player is providing his value. There's the finishing touch, there's defense, which is kind of his impact on his team preventing scoring chances against. There's the offense, which is how he impacts when he's on the ice, his team creating more scoring chances, the power play and penalty kill and penalty differential and all that stuff. What I want to do on those cards is give the best possible, prediction and projection of what that player is going to do, next. So in this case, it would be, what is he going to do this upcoming season? Now, those are based on the past 3 years of results. And, they're all kind of, the years are weighted based on what has been most predictive in the past, because at this point we have about 15 years of numbers to go off of. And so, it might be, in the case of a stat like the offense driving, the most recent year is really, really important for predicting, whereas the previous 2 years are maybe not so much. For finishing, it's a lot more spread out because there's a lot of puck luck that can go into it that you're trying to filter out. So it's based on the past 3 years, the numbers on those cards, but weighted in such a way that will give us kind of the best way of predicting what's going to come next for that player. And, like I said before, everything from stats to the eye test become less predictable and less predictive when a player moves teams compared to when they stay on the same team. That's just the nature of the beast. But, interestingly, I kind of tested it this season, and the stats that are the most stable when a player changes teams compared to when they stay on the same team are the wins above replacement ones. So if you look at, for example, goals or assists, when a player moves teams, their goal scoring and their assisting varies wildly. Like, it becomes way less predictable than if they stay on the same team. And a lot of that comes down to different systems, different chemistry, different line mates, maybe different deployment. So if you're using goals and assists to kind of figure out how you think a player is going to do in a new environment, it might be really, really unpredictable. The wins above replacement ones actually are pretty stable if a player shifts teams, which tells me that they are kind of getting into something isolated about that player himself. That's kind of isolating his impact from everything around him, which is what they're supposed to do. So I think that's encouraging. So overall, I would say, yeah, it's about taking what he's done relatively recently and giving you kind of the best estimate of what's coming in the upcoming season for him. And it's always integrating new information. So, like, when the new season starts, it will be including data from the 23-24 season to give the best idea of what's coming forward for him.
Okay. So question two, you've I think kind of already answered with in question one, I was going to ask you, as far as your cards are concerned, you accept all of the information that you have as a whole. Everything that you've compiled is there as a means to give the most accurate predictions of what to expect from any player and so forth. If all of those stats, all of that analytics makes people just the information overload kind of thing, where they tune out or they just whatever, where would you point them? What stat are you going to point them to above all else that you compile that gives the most accurate assessment? And I think as you just put it, it's WAR. Is that what I'm to understand?
Yeah, I mean, I would usually kind of recommend against just kind of fixating on the one number. I mean, the ones that show up on the player cards, I think that kind of, there's not that many numbers on it, and it's all, it's tries to be at least as simple as possible, where you have, here's the different areas of the game, you have the percentile rankings, it's obviously all color coded and pretty and everything. I mean, I think that is meant to give kind of a good snapshot, and I think it's pretty reliable. I don't think it's a be all end all. I'll always encourage people to, like I have on the Patreon, and I do post pretty frequently, kind of deeper stat cards that they have the wins above replacement number, but they also have the kind of micro stat detailed numbers on things like, how are they creating scoring chances for themselves? How are they setting up scoring chances by passing? How do they transition the puck? Which also uses the same kind of percentile system, but there's just a little bit more detail, and it can give you a more nuanced view of how a player is creating his results. I always, like to encourage people to kind of take that extra step and get a little bit more in depth. And I think if you present it the right way, or at least I hope that if you present it the right way, it's not quite so scary as if you're just using, raw numbers. Like, I think it's easier to understand, okay, Sebastian Aho is, in the 95th percentile, with the big blue number next to him at creating scoring chances, as opposed to if I just said Sebastian Aho creates 3.7 scoring chances per 60, which, that doesn't mean anything to anybody. Nobody knows like how that compares to other guys around the league. So, the hope is, I think, to try to take a lot of information and present it in a way that, even if you're not a numbers guy, it's intuitive enough that it makes sense to you, and you can kind of put it into hockey terms in your own head that are kind of, more eye test oriented. Like, instead of being like, okay, his wins above replacement is 1.023 or whatever, you can look at it and say, okay, this player is a good defensive player, good at preventing scoring chances, he creates chances for himself, he carries the puck in transition, all that kind of stuff that you would say for yourself after watching a guy play, even if you didn't have any data in front of you, and hopefully having the data be included in that will just make it a little bit more accurate.
Okay, that's great. I love that answer, and it certainly explains the value of the cards that you've created, because it's terrific. I have just one more question before I turn over to Brad, who's got a number of other ones. Now, you say you have 15 years of stats that you've been compiling and so forth. As far as your cards go, if you were to spread out the card year per year and stuff, and did it in a line graph or whatever to explain someone's career, would you, do the cards stay relatively close to the same, where basically this is where he started and he kind of stayed there? Or can you actually follow their careers going up and down depending on where they are, where they're playing? Because there's a lot of player movement. Gone are the days where it's almost unicorn like to have one player play with one team their whole career, right? So they move around all the time. if you were to string out 15 years of stats in your cards and stuff, does it give you the ups and downs of their entire career, or do they stay pretty, one type of player is the way he is no matter where he is?
Well, I think it depends. I think you've accidentally given me a good plug here, because that Alex Semin card that your co-host was, or maybe it was you, was referring to, is part of the kind of new historical quote unquote player cards that we actually just rolled out this week, which include kind of a full timeline for the player between 2007 and today. So, the Alex Semin card that he was referring to has a full timeline across it for his entire career. So you can see, like we were talking about, when he was peaking with the Caps, when he was a 30 goal or a 40 goal scorer with, just a brilliant wrist shot, through to the end of his career with the Hurricanes and I guess the Canadiens after that, when his wrist got hurt and he just couldn't put the puck in the net anymore. There's ebbs and flows, like I've referred to. Anytime a player switches teams, everything goes a little bit up in the air. It becomes a little bit less predictable. But I think what you see from those cards that do cover all that time, there's plenty of players who have been playing since 2007-08. So you can see 15 years of their career kind of coming and going. And there are players that stay remarkably stable. You have your Claude Giroux and Joe Pavelski's and Sidney Crosby's. And there's players for whom there's, a real kind of up and down, what we would call in the stats community, what we call the age curve, which is the understanding that in pretty much every area of the game, a player is going to peak, the average player is going to peak at a certain age and then start to decline. And you see that present for, almost any player. I posted Danny Heatley the other day, where at the beginning of the sample in 2007-08, he's a 40 goal scorer. He's a brilliant offensive player. And then over the course of time, he's just kind of declining bit by bit until eventually in 2015, he's, barely NHL caliber and he ends up retiring. That's the pattern that I think you mostly see for a lot of players. But, there is variation. There are guys who start to decline and then they suddenly salvage their careers, like, former Hurricane Eric Stahl, I think, is a good example of that, where things were going south for him and then he picked it up all of a sudden. There's examples like that. But one thing that I've really enjoyed from working on and then kind of putting out these historical cards is having the ability, because we have these 15 years of data, to really kind of map, the trajectories of a lot of players who have been playing for a long time and figuring out how their careers went.
Well, the one thing that you'll find here in the Storm Cellar, we're all about pimping our guests' work. We love when we bring in a guest that provides the information like you have, you and your partner. I think it's important that we promote it as much as possible. So if we stumbled into that and Brad finding that Semin card had a chance to share it with me, I was looking at it as like, man, it's all there. Those cards are fantastic. And they do exactly like you said. So the historical cards are terrific. Brad, I know you've got a few questions here from Twitter, so I've taken up too much time. I got my information that I needed. Fire away, because I know we've got our other listeners out there that had questions for you too, Jack.
We do have a few questions. I have to say, if you look, so historically, I've been enjoying those. That's where I found the Semin card. And just like Jack said, they tend to be at a level and then you kind of see the drop off and you go, getting older. The exception is, for listeners, at JFresh Hockey, hop on the Twitter, find the Pablo Datsek card, because from 07, 08 to 15, 16, he's just at 99% the whole time. The card never moves. The timeline is just a flat. Yeah. He's just that good. I mean,
the day he stepped out of the league, he was one of the best defensive players in the game, and he was still amazing offensively. It really is like he probably could have played for another 5 years in the NHL, and I don't know if you ever would have seen him fall off. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. It's just an interesting card, because when I first saw him, I'm like, oh, it's Pablo. Like, this is going to be good. And I'm like, it's just his WAR is 99% for 9 years in a row. So, friend of the show, Eric ERICH_K8 and you've kind of answered some of these. So he said it's a two-parter. What inspired you to begin tracking player and team stats, which you kind of answered, but you might want to rehash that maybe really quickly. for Eric. And then he said, what was one player's card stats that surprised you the most?
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with the first one. I didn't actually start doing this stuff until the pandemic, or it might have been right before the pandemic. A lot of it, honestly, it was by accident. I never set out to have anything close to what's happened in the past couple of years. It really was. I was learning some programs for my own non-hockey career. I was in graduate school, and all the sample data was boring as hell. And so I just replaced it with hockey data and started using that. And then, started kind of building some visualizations from it and put them out on Twitter, and everything kind of blew up from there. But, in terms of, tracking all the players' stats and stuff, I should, because I have to give a shout out to the people who I work with. A lot of all the number crunching, under the hood, I really have to give the credit to that for Patrick, who, is the one who's running these programs all the time and updating models and things like that. For me, and I know that you'll understand this from, your own broadcasting career. For me, it's really all about the communication and the design, really kind of trying to make sure that this stuff makes sense, that it looks attractive, that people want to share it and they want to use it to start conversations. And so far, I've been fortunate enough to have that happen. And then, especially since he kind of mentioned tracking all this stuff for players, we've been lucky enough to have, Corey, who I talked about earlier, we've been able to license some of his data and include it on player cards. So that's kind of the more detailed microstats I was talking about. And he's been doing this stuff for years and years. Like, he was doing tracking projects with Eric Tulsky back before he was ever with the Hurricanes. He's been a huge fixture and one of, if not the most kind of important part of the public hockey stat conversation, and he, like, because of how long he's been doing it, how committed he is, and how much work that he's done, we have like an immense data set going back to 2016-17 of such detailed data that, like, every time I work with it, I'm kind of blown away by it. So yeah, it really kind of comes down to bringing together the work of a lot of really dedicated people and then trying to make it make sense as much as possible, trying to appeal to the hockey fan who had similar math grades to me in high school. As for a player card that really surprised me, that's
yeah. And he said good or bad, like, just one that maybe sticks out, like, oh, like, I did not expect that.
Well, I mean, one that does always shock people, although, I think at this point, maybe I've talked about it enough that it doesn't, is, I mean, there's a type of player where they may not show up as well in the stats as you might expect them to offensively because of the way that they play the game. Like the even strength offense number that appears on those player cards, it's about a player's impact on scoring chances, essentially, as they're, as shots are tracked by the NHL. And there's certain things that the NHL data set takes into account, and there's certain things it doesn't. One of the things it doesn't is passes that happen before a shot is taken. And those can be hugely important to how likely it is that a shot is going to go in. Obviously, a pass across the crease is going to make a shot way more dangerous than if you're jamming it into pads from close range. Unfortunately, that's not something that WAR numbers can take into account. And so that's where you end up, I guess this is me leading into talking about a guy like Patrick Kane, whose strength offense numbers have been very poor the past couple of years because he doesn't really create a lot of offense within the slot, because he would prefer to pass the puck, across the slot to a guy who maybe is a little further away from the net, but who has more open net to shoot at. So that will usually surprise quite a few people. And it's one reason why, I like, kind of the expanded cards that show you some of the passing metrics, because you can see, and Patrick Kane's passing has declined a decent amount. He wasn't very good with the Rangers, obviously. But when you see the passing numbers added to the card, I think it adds a little bit more context of why it may seem a little counterintuitive that Patrick Kane is rated so poorly on offense compared to some guys who, are certainly less talented than he is.
Oh, that makes total sense. So, Gleb Hockey asked advice for somebody looking to enter the hockey analytics community, and also how do you feel about people using your cards as the end all be all in terms of a player's value?
Well, I mean, for the first one, I have a hard time giving too much advice because it was a bit flukish how I got involved in it anyway. You know, like a lot of people kind of go through the hard data science route, or they, attend conferences and things like that. You know, for me, I think it really was kind of a happy accident in terms of, when the pandemic hit and, what kind of void I was filling. I think I stumbled onto a gap that there was in hockey analytics coverage that people were interested in. That turned out the way it is. I mean, if you're trying to work for a team, it really seems like pursuing data science academically is how you want to go. I mean, I have no interest in working for a team. I'm happy doing what I'm doing, but when I've seen postings for teams going around, it always seems like they're looking for people with master's level work in fancy data science, which, I think makes a little bit of sense because, a lot of the kind of qualitative analysis and bringing the stuff together, I think teams figure that they can train former players or more kind of traditional hockey executive types in working out the data, and what they really want is kind of number crunchers to work with that technical stuff. If that bores you, and I mean, it bores me, I wouldn't blame you. Then, especially for public stuff, I really think it comes down to finding niches that haven't been filled and, publicizing yourself as well as you can, putting out high quality work, making it attractive, making it something that people want to read or click on or share. If it's a visualization, making it look pretty is honestly a shocking amount of what's important. And, like for example, one thing that, I used to say, and I still think, is that for people who are trying to get into, for example, covering, their favorite team, if they want to be a blogger or something for it, one opening that there kind of always is that nobody ever really seems to fill would be, sitting in front of the games and tracking stats yourself, giving yourself a data set that nobody else has that you can write smart hockey analysis about. If you have numbers that nobody else has, then you can write purely eye test based articles that are backed up by, a stable of hard data that's just yours. And the guy who I mentioned earlier, who Kyle Dubas hired with for the Leafs, Cam Charron, that's what he did this year for the Leafs and the Canucks. He tracked every single game. He wrote these great blog posts about them, and now he works for the Penguins. So, there you go. It's that there are routes into hockey analytics, and they go in a lot of different directions. So, play to your strengths and try to do something that nobody else is doing.
Okay, so now that answer just sparked another question for me. I don't know, Brad, do we have any others? But I'll hold on to my question and let them go.
We do, but it's a really simple one.
Oh, okay. So go ahead, fire that one, and then I'll bring mine in.
All right. Alex Pitty, maybe? Alex _ PITTI wants to know, what is your favorite color?
Oh man. I wear a lot of navy blue. I'm like all the NHL jerseys in the early 2000s, where I probably wear that much navy blue. I will say though, to be Hurricanes relevant, I did love those throwback jerseys they were wearing in the playoffs. I wish they would switch to those full time. So maybe I'll give that will be my official answer, is the bright red on those Canes jerseys.
Beauty.
Those 25th anniversary jerseys are beautiful, I got to tell you. Okay, so my question now is, and it's a little bit more on the fun side or whatever, knowing what you do and knowing what you know and compiling all of those stats and stuff. I mean, you've kind of got an intuition about the players, knowledge about what you can expect and stuff like that. I mean, you're kind of ahead of the game, and that's like an understatement, because what you've got is amazing. It blows my mind. When you go to the bar to watch a game with your guys, right? and you hear them chirping certain things, are there times when you're saying, guys, it's your emotions that are making you say that? That's really not what this guy is like. You know what I mean? Like, where do you hear these outlandish statements from your guys and stuff that just don't match what the player actually is based on the stats?
Well, you know what? To be fully honest with you, and actually, I had a team barbecue with my beer league hockey team yesterday, and there was plenty of NHL chat. I set it aside. I'm not out here correcting anybody's because honestly, like watching the game, with your buddies at a bar and overreacting to everything, and crap talking all the players and stuff like that. That's the fun part of hockey. So unless they specifically like ask me something, oh, is this guy's numbers good, or should they trade for this guy or anything like that, then I'll give an answer that probably sounds a bit like what I've said to you guys, or the way I've talked to you guys today. But most of the time I'm happy to just watch the game like anybody else. I mean, that's it's like I was saying before, like if anybody doesn't give a crap about analytics, that's not how they like to enjoy hockey. I mean, I think there's plenty of room for that, and it can be a lot of the time the most fun way to watch hockey is to overreact and make it emotional and all that kind of stuff. So I'm fully on board with it, and honestly, even when it comes to broadcasters or writers or things like that, there are some people who they kind of need a lot of stat stuff, like like every columnist needs to fully understand and integrate analytics, or every broadcast needs to have a bunch of stats and stuff. If it's good work, it's good work. Like the non-analyticsy side of hockey, that's where I come from, and that's I think totally valid and a fun way to watch. So anyway, people enjoy it. I'm not going to begrudge them that, and I'm definitely not going to get a drink thrown in my face because I told them that someone's expected goals were better than they think.
Well, Jack, if you were a fly on the wall, or you could watch Brad and I's messages between each other through every game, you would see we're probably one of the worst for the overreactions and emotional aspects of it, to be sure. Brad, I know
I tell
you've got
everybody,
another one.
if you want my logical opinion on a game, you got to give me 24 hours. Like what I say during the game, you can kind of, you can kind of say, okay, Brad's just being emotional, and that's because that's what makes hockey fun, right? Is you get emotionally involved. It's like if you want my actual analysis, like I got to calm down first, right? That's 100%. I actually thought of one more question. Oh, go ahead. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just add on the emotional bit, because I was talking about earlier how Chris Kunitz was the bane of my existence when he was helping the Penguins win back-to-back cups. Because I just pure irrational emotion, me thinking that he was washed up and everything. Like my girlfriend, remembers me sitting on the couch watching that game, the game 7 double overtime against Ottawa, where he scored the winning goal to send them to the Cup final. And I don't remember it, but she tells me that my reaction to him scoring was just bursting out laughing because of how much I had been talking crap about him for the previous like 3 or 4 years. So it can those irrational grudges can pay off. So I would recommend you keep them around.
There you go.
Absolutely. Have you, 2-part question. Part 1, have you ever given 100% WAR? I know statistics, that's not really a thing, but part 2, when you give one, will it definitely be Alexander Nikishin for the Hurricanes?
Well, so there is guaranteed to always be 100th percentile WAR. So it works percentiles, right? So like 99 means like your WAR is better than 99% of players around the NHL. And so, with the way the rounding works, there's always kind of 2 or 3 forwards and two or so defensemen who are going to get the 100th percentile. And it's usually, you can kind of guess who it's going to be. Like it's, Connor McDavid is in the 100th percentile. Sidney Crosby was for a huge amount of his career. Alex Ovechkin was. I think Austin Matthews is probably pretty high up there because his shot is and before the season was just so reliable and unbelievable. So there are quite a few 100th percentile players, especially if you explore those historical cards. I think there's some interesting ones from the past, especially on the blue line, that might be a little surprising sometimes. But I mean, for Nikishin, he obviously doesn't have an NHL player card yet, but he's we do prospect cards, which are kind of based on something called NHLE, which is, I'm not going to explain it now because there's a lot that goes into it, but it's essentially kind of a prospect projection model. And Nikishin obviously shot up super far this year. I think he ranks third in that model after the season he had in the KHL. So he's not a 100 percentile WAR player in the NHL yet, but he's certainly trending insanely well.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you tell us what your take on Connor Bedard is? Everyone's been losing their mind over him. Same way they did with Crosby, with Connor McDavid. I mean, what are we looking at with Bedard?
Well, so and actually, you know what, honestly, probably the best perk that has come from this whole hockey analytics adventure that I've been on is that I was actually credentialed for the World Juniors in Halifax. I got to cover the tournament in my hometown back in December. So I was in the press. I was in the press box for that whole tournament, watched every single minute he played, and had the chance to talk to him after every game, which was pretty nuts. But I mean, I've never seen a hockey player dominate a tournament, any tournament, as much as he did in the World Juniors. It really was like you see the point totals, you see the highlight reel goals, but the process under it was just he was just creating scoring chances every which way, 10 or 12 times a game it seemed, and getting a whole lot of points on them. It's not just the shot, it's not just the hands. His passing is unbelievable. He's more physical than people really give credit for, I think, because he's 5'10", I think, but he's 5'10" in a lot of the same way that Sidney Crosby is 5'10". I think he's kind of internalized how you can succeed at that side, at that size in the NHL. I think he's an unbelievable player. And honestly, talking to him pretty frequently, I was expecting him to be kind of a Crosby or McDavid style, robot. And he certainly knows how to give a good canned answer when asked, but he actually surprised me in how much he just kind of seemed like a pretty normal hockey playing kid, who would actually make jokes and things like that. So I think seems to have a decent head on his shoulders, and his talent is unbelievable. So I'm a little annoyed that he went to Chicago, but I'm very excited. He's going to be playing his first game against the Penguins. So if he undresses Erik Karlsson 5 or 6 times, I won't be too pleased, but his potential is unbelievable.
There you go. Jack, if there were cards made for the Storm Cellar, okay, where they were compiling information, this episode would put us in that 99 percentile. This has been unbelievably informative, interesting. You've taken a mind like mine, where I'm telling you, I am a eyes only kind of guy. You've opened my eyes and guided me into a direction where I can look at some of these cards and actually understand what WAR is and what all of those other stats are. So Jack, you joining us, thank you so much. We really appreciate this, and I know all of our Storm Cellar listeners are really going to appreciate it as well. It's right around this time where we give you a chance to promote yourself. And Brad, backhandedly, indirectly promoted you, as you had mentioned earlier, but now's your chance. The spotlight's on you. Fire it out there. Tell people how they can connect with you, because it is so worth it.
Yeah. Well, I first of all, I really appreciate it, guys. Glad you could get me on here. I go by JFresh Hockey on Twitter. You can follow me on there. Things are going a little slow right now, but especially once the season picks up, I post pretty frequently. A lot of hockey stuff, a lot of analytics, a lot of just goofing around as well when things are going slow. And if any of the graphics and stuff that you either see on that Twitter page or that you've heard us talk about sound interesting to you, I do run a Patreon where you can subscribe. There's $5 and $10 tiers. The $5 tier, you get all the wins above replacement player cards at the $10 tier, you get the ones that have like the extra detailed microstat tracking that I was talking about. And like they alluded to, the historical player cards did just drop this week. There's over, I think, 10,800 of them because they stretch away from 07, 08 until the present day. So if you're interested in not only looking at, numbers for current players, but you kind of want to see how players from 10 or 15 years ago graded out using these modern analytical techniques, it gives you the opportunity. And like you guys said, there's like a timeline card as well where you can look at the player's progression over the entire 15-year span, which I've personally, a lot of the stuff that I'm putting together, a lot of the times I'm making it because I want to see it. And in this case, I've been having a lot of fun even going through them. So if that interests you, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/JFresh Hockey, or just follow me on Twitter.
It's awesome.
Man, oh man. Brad, I don't what more can you say after this? This has been, we've had a lot of great episodes and a lot of fun, but this one is the next level for me. I don't know about you.
I've been looking forward to this since Jack agreed to come on a while ago. And glad we were able to get him on. And it's kind of a slow season, which is good probably for him as well, though he just chopped all those cards. So this has been phenomenal. I will say this, Phil Kessel is the best Penguin of all time, and there is no discussion. That's a statement. that's not an open for interpretation or discussion.
I did hear somebody called him the patron saint of beer leaguers today. I think that fits.
Whenever my wife complains, maybe I put on a few extra pounds, I remind her that Phil Kessel and I both have pro hockey player bodies.
There you go. Just like that. Jack, thank you so much. Brad, we have talked about a lot here. We've got a great guest in who gave us the background. We talked about war, lots of stats, historical figures.
This will be good for newer fans too. This is a great one.
It's going to be great, but there isn't something missing, is there?
Go Canes.
Go Canes.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. Ray and I greatly appreciate your support in helping us produce an informative and fun podcast. As always, we'd like to say that we believe hockey is for everyone. Whether you're a Caniac or a bunch of jerks, doesn't matter, as we're just a couple of jerks anyway. We would love to hear your questions, comments, and suggestions. We will do our best to answer anything hockey related. You can reach us via email at stormcellar97@gmail.com. On Twitter, we are at stormcellar97, and on Facebook at facebook.com/stormcellar97.